All right, so now let's take out your special quadrilaterals worksheet that you got yesterday. We didn't have all of the notes yet, and so that's okay. So now we're going to go over your special quads worksheet here. Some questions that you may have had. All right, so looking at this, here's number 4. So I'm not going to touch on everything because you can check Brightspace for the answers and kind of a little bit of explanation on things. But I did want to talk about this because you will see something like this again for your test. Okay, and so complete the table, put check marks in the appropriate columns if the quadrilateral has the given characteristic. And so the first one is opposite sides are congruent. And so we for sure know that's parallelogram. But rectangles also had everything that a parallelogram had, so I need to mark that there. Rhombus also had everything that a parallelogram had, so I need to check there. And squares also had everything that a parallelogram had. Okay, so I mark all of those. All the opposite sides are congruent for all 4. Diagonals form 2 congruent triangles. Well, let's think about that. So if I know in a parallelogram, opposite sides are congruent, so I can mark those. And if I draw in a diagonal, well, that's going to be congruent to itself. So then these 2 triangles that I just created with the diagonal made 2 congruent triangles by side-side-side theorem. Okay, so diagonals form 2 congruent triangles. That is true for parallelogram. And any characteristic that's true for a parallelogram is true for a rectangle, a rhombus, and a square. Okay, diagonals bisect each other. So that was true for a parallelogram. So check. It was true for, if it's true for a parallelogram, then again, rectangle has all the characteristics of a parallelogram, rhombus has all the characteristics of a parallelogram, and now we know squares have all the characteristics of parallelogram because we finished up notes. Okay, so I'm not going to do all of these, but I'm going to skip around here. So all sides are congruent. Well, that was not a characteristic or part of the definition of a parallelogram, so I'm not going to check here. Rectangle, nope. All sides are congruent was not part of its definition nor its characteristics, and it wasn't true for parallelogram either, so I'm not going to mark it here. And then rhombus, though, the definition of rhombus is that all sides are congruent. So that'll be a check there for rhombus. And square, that's part of the definition, is that all sides are congruent. Okay. Let's look at diagonals are congruent. So diagonals are congruent. Parallelogram, that was not true for the definition, and it wasn't one of the 4 characteristics of parallelogram, so I don't check there. Diagonals are congruent, though, was one of the special characteristics of a rectangle, so I will check that. Rhombus has everything a parallelogram had, which I didn't check here because it doesn't have that, and it had its own about diagonals being perpendicular and diagonals bisect the angles, but not diagonals are congruent, so I don't check here. And a square had everything that a parallelogram, rectangle, and rhombus had. So if a rectangle had diagonals are congruent, then a square also will satisfy that diagonals are congruent. Okay, so that's kind of how you would fill that out. And so you can check your answers on filling out those others, but I just did 5 rows in that table. All right, I'm not going to do all these. It was just easier to snip and clip all of it here. But just here on 5, 6, 7, and 8, you're not giving me a value. Only time you give me a value is when you see an equal sign. If you see a congruent sign, I'm looking for, like here you have a segment, then I'm looking for the segment that it's going to be congruent to. I'm not looking for a number answer. Same here, I've got angle something is congruent, then it has to be another angle that I put here. And since we know it's a parallelogram, then we're just using characteristics of a parallelogram or definition of parallelogram if needed. Okay, so here, for instance, segment NM. Well, in a parallelogram, we know that opposite sides are congruent, so the opposite side of NM is KL, so that means that those 2 segments are congruent to each other. So the blank should be segment KL, or if you switched around, segment LK works. Okay? All right, angle MNK. MNK is this whole angle, including 6 and 5. So in a parallelogram, we know that opposite angles are congruent to each other. So the angle opposite this angle N here is angle L. And so then I would write angle MLK. Now you can't just write angle L because remember there's a couple angles there, so you have to use the 3 letters for it. Okay. All right, so I'll let you fill in the others and check on Brightspace those. Now we're talking supplementary here. So angle NKL. NKL is this angle right here, this whole angle from there to there. And it's going to be supplementary to a couple of angles because we learned that in a parallelogram, consecutive angles are supplementary. So consecutive angles are angles across, or I'm sorry, are angles next to each other. So this angle N, again, that's not your bow. This angle N here is going to be consecutive. So then angle KNM, oops, wrong one, is supplementary to this NKL. And then this angle L right here is also going to be supplementary because it's consecutive or next to this angle here. So then that would, the other blank would be angle KLM. So this angle is supplementary to this one because they're consecutive angles, and this angle is consecutive to this angle that we have marked, and so that's supplementary. Let's see, I'm only gonna do, let's do this number 12 one here. So let me erase that piece. On number 12, I know that the measure of angle 6 here is 2y minus 4. And the measure of angle 2 is y minus 2. So those are angles. And I want to solve for y. Well, one thing I know about opposite sides of a parallelogram is that they are parallel. So I could put in these parallel pieces here. And so hopefully you guys see a z here. And so using this z, that means those armpit angles 6 and 2 are congruent to each other. So then that means you set them equal to each other to solve. 2y minus 4 equals y minus 2. Because again, opposite sides are parallel, so using what we did in chapter 3, you see a z here, so armpit angles, angles 6 and 2 are congruent. So you set them equal to each other. I'm going to minus y, so y minus 4 equals negative 2. Add 4, so y is 2. Okay? So you're using either the definition or the characteristics of a parallelogram to be able to find what it is they ask you to find. All right, I'm just going to do one of these. I'll just do number 13 because we did one like number 14 in your notes. Actually, it's almost the exact same one. I think it uses the same letters and numbers and everything. So we know SLAM is a rectangle. And so rectangles had all the characteristics of a parallelogram. Opposite sides are congruent. Diagonals bisect each other. Opposite angles M and L would be congruent, and A and S would be congruent, which makes sense because in a rectangle all these angles are 90 anyway. So I could put that in there if I wanted to. Consecutive angles are supplementary because 90 plus 90 is 180. And I think that's it. So then one thing though that a rectangle had that was special is that this whole diagonal from M to L is going to equal this whole diagonal from S to A. And then since diagonals bisect each other, then that means all of 4 of these little pieces in a rectangle will be congruent to each other. So then now I'm going to put in information. MO equals 10. So then I need to know what is OL going to be. Well, that's also going to be 10. Then I need to know what SO is going to be. Oh, well, that's also going to be 10. And then I need to know what SA is, which is the whole diagonal. So 10 plus 10 is 20. So then the one special characteristic of a rectangle is that that a parallelogram doesn't have is that the diagonals are congruent to each other. All right, and then we skip to this one because I won't do any of the rhombus or square ones because I want you guys to be able to practice it now that we went over the notes, and then I'll do some questions on it next time. And so part of your homework tonight is to finish the other ones so that you get practice on those. These are all parallelograms, and we want to find the values of the variable. So I'm only going to do a couple. So I'll do this number 20. So on number 20, these are all angles within the parallelogram. So what do we know about opposite angles in a parallelogram? They're congruent. So I'm going to set 2y equal to 130. That's how I use the geometry to set up the equation. Now it's algebra, divide by 2, and you get 65 degrees. So y is 65 degrees. All right, what do we know about consecutive angles in a parallelogram? Well, consecutive angles are supplementary. So 3x minus 10 plus 130 has to add up to 180. Combine like terms, so 3x plus 120 equals 180. Solve for x minus 120, 3x equals 60, and so when you divide, x is 20. Okay? So again, we're using characteristics to set up and solve, and x is 20 degrees. There we go. All right, so now let's look at, now on this one, this 3x represents this length from here to here. 2x plus 10 represents the length from here to here. 8y minus 4 represents the length from here to here, and 6y plus 12 represents the length of the segment from here to here. So those are not degrees because they don't have degrees on them. Okay? But I'm going to look at 22. So on 22, what do we know about opposite sides of a parallelogram? They're congruent. So 3y is going to equal 2y plus 8. So minus y, or 2y, that's y equals 8. Now on that one, I'm not going to put degrees because that is a side length, and side lengths are not measured in degrees. Now, in a parallelogram, what do we know about opposite sides? They're congruent and they're also parallel to each other, so I'm going to put the parallel marks. And so then I could do what we did in chapter 3 with the z thing here, and these armpit angles are going to be congruent. So then I would set 5x equal to 55 and then solve for x. Now that one will have degrees on it because it has x is in the angle position. Okay. Now real quick on this one, remember diagonals bisect each other. So if I marked my picture, that means it would look like this. So then that will help you set up your equations appropriately, because if they're congruent segments, then you set them equal to each other to solve. Okay, so again, you can check out the answers on Brightspace, and part of your homework now is to get more practice on the rhombus and square one now that we went over the rhombus and square notes. And then we'll do just one section. I know on your sheet it says 8.3 and 8.4 on the tracking sheet that we were going to cover, but we're just going to cover one section. And then I'll tell you on that worksheet which problems you'll do for that one section. Okay?